The cemetery was supposed to be empty. Richard Chun had planned it that way, arriving early before the groundskeepers or other visitors could witness what he'd come to do. 5 years of avoiding this place. 5 years of guilt festering like an untreated wound. And now he stood at the iron gates with a single white rose and words he should have said when it mattered. But as he walked through the rows of weathered headstones, his polished Italian shoes crunching on gravel, he saw them. 2 small figures huddled beside a grave, their shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. Twin girls, maybe 6 years old, with identical dark braids and matching yellow dresses that seemed too bright for such a solemn place. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe, give this video a like, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're tuning in from. Now, let's begin. They looked up as he approached, and Richard's world tilted off its axis. The eyes staring back at him were his own, the same deep brown, the same slight upturn at the corners, the same stubborn set to their small jaws. But it was impossible. His ex-wife Elena had never mentioned children. Never once in their bitter divorce proceedings had there been any talk of pregnancy or babies or anything that would explain the 2 perfect mirrors of his own face, now watching him with curious confusion. "Are you here to see our mama?" one of them asked, her voice carrying the particular sweetness that children use when they're trying to be polite while their hearts are breaking. Richard's mouth went dry. The rose in his hand suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Because there, carved into the granite headstone beside which these impossible children sat, was Elena's full name. Elena Marie Chun. The woman who had walked away from their marriage with nothing but a suitcase and a promise that she never wanted to see him again. The woman who had apparently taken more with her than either of them had realized. The lawyer's office smelled like leather and bad coffee, its walls lined with law books that looked more decorative than functional. Richard sat across from Patricia Wells, one of the city's best family attorneys, while Sarah and Sophie, he learned their names now, played quietly with coloring books in the corner. 3 days had passed since the cemetery. 3 days of emergency custody arrangements and DNA tests, and sleepless nights in hotel rooms that cost more per night than most people made in a month. "The situation is complex," Patricia said, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who'd seen too many broken families to offer false hope. "Elena never listed you on their birth certificates. There's no record of you having any legal relationship to these children. From the court's perspective, you're essentially a stranger who shares their DNA." Richard watched his daughters. The words still felt foreign in his mind, as they carefully colored within the lines. Sophie hummed a tune he didn't recognize. Sarah chewed on her bottom lip in concentration, a habit that made his chest ache with recognition because he did the same thing during board meetings. "What does that mean for them?" he asked. "Right now, they're in temporary state custody. The neighbor who'd been caring for them, Mrs. Patterson, can only keep them for another week. After that, they'll enter the foster system unless we can establish your parental rights or find another relative." The foster system. Richard's blood ran cold. These children, his children, who had already lost the only parent they'd ever known, could be scattered to different homes, different families, different lives entirely. They might never see each other again. How long does establishing parental rights take? Months, maybe longer. And that's assuming there are no complications. Patricia leaned forward. "Richard, I need you to understand something. The state doesn't care about your net worth or your business empire. They care about stability, consistency, and what's best for the children. You've been absent for their entire lives. Even with DNA proof, that's a significant hurdle." Sophie looked up from her coloring book. "Daddy, are we going to live with you?" The word hit him like a physical blow. Daddy. She'd started calling him that yesterday, completely unprompted, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. Sarah had been more reserved, still calling him Mr. Richard, but even she had begun to soften around the edges. "I'm going to try," he told her, and the inadequacy of those words made him want to punch something. Patricia gathered her papers. "There's something else you need to know. Elena's sister, Rebecca, has filed a petition for custody as well. She lives in Portland, has 2 children of her own, and can provide immediate placement. From a legal standpoint, her case is stronger than yours." Richard's heart stopped. Elena had a sister? You didn't know? He shook his head. 5 years of marriage. And Elena had mentioned family only in passing, always changing the subject when he tried to probe deeper. He'd assumed she was estranged from them, that they'd been a closed book she didn't want to open. Rebecca Morrison. She's a nurse, married, stable income, and she's been trying to get custody of the girls since Elena's death. The only reason she hasn't succeeded yet is because the girls specifically asked to stay with Mrs. Patterson while they waited for their daddy to find them. The room spun. They'd been waiting for him. 2 children he'd never known existed had somehow been hoping he would come, holding onto a father figure that existed only in their mother's stories and their own desperate imagination. How long do I have? The custody hearing is in 2 weeks. If you can't prove you're capable of providing a stable, loving home by then, the court will almost certainly award custody to Rebecca. These children need certainty, not a legal battle that could drag on for years. 2 weeks to prove he deserved something he'd never known he'd lost. 2 weeks to become the father he should have been all along. 2 weeks to save the only family he had left. The stakes couldn't be higher. If he failed, Sarah and Sophie would disappear into a life he couldn't follow, with an aunt they barely knew in a city 3,000 miles away. He would lose them before he'd ever really found them. But worse than that, they would lose each other's only constant companion in a world that had already taken too much away. The call came at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, jarring Richard from the first peaceful sleep he'd had in weeks. Mrs. Patterson's voice was strained, barely above a whisper. "Mr. Chun, you need to come quickly. It's Sophie." Richard was in his car within minutes, racing through empty streets toward the small house where his daughters had been staying. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles went white. In the weeks since the custody hearing had been scheduled, he'd fallen into a routine of daily visits, carefully supervised interactions, and a gradual building of trust that felt as fragile as spun glass. But something had changed tonight. He found Mrs. Patterson waiting on the porch, her gray hair unkempt, her face drawn with worry. "She won't stop crying," she said as he bounded up the steps. "She's been asking for you for hours, but I wasn't supposed to call. The social worker said only in emergencies." "This is an emergency," Richard said, pushing past her into the house. He heard Sophie before he saw her. Quiet, broken sobs coming from the small bedroom at the end of the hall. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, her hand on her sister's back, looking lost and frightened in a way that made Richard's chest physically ache. "Hey," he said softly, kneeling beside the bed. "I'm here. What's wrong, sweetheart?" Sophie turned toward him, her face streaked with tears and swollen from crying. "I dreamed about Mama," she whispered. "She was trying to tell me something, but I couldn't hear her. And when I woke up, I forgot what she looked like." The words hit Richard like a sledgehammer. In all his focus on legal battles and custody arrangements, he'd forgotten that these children were still actively grieving, still processing the loss of the only parent they'd ever known. And now that parent's face was beginning to fade from memory. "I brought something," he said quietly, pulling out his phone. He'd spent the previous week digitizing every photo he could find of Elena, working with Mrs. Patterson to gather pictures from Elena's house. He swiped to a photo of Elena laughing, her head thrown back, joy radiating from every pixel. Sophie's crying slowed. "That's Mama," she breathed. "She's beautiful," Richard said. "Just like you. Both of you." Sarah scooted closer, studying the photo with intense concentration. "I remember when she looked like that, before she got sick." Richard showed them more pictures. Elena gardening, Elena reading, Elena pushing 2 babies in a double stroller through a park Richard had never seen. His heart broke and mended simultaneously with each image, watching the life his ex-wife had built without him, a life that had been full of love despite the absence he'd created. "Can we keep these?" Sophie asked. "These are yours," Richard said. "They've always been yours." But as he helped the girls settle back into bed, Mrs. Patterson pulled him aside. "Mr. Chun, there's something else. Rebecca Morrison called earlier tonight. She's flying in tomorrow." Richard's blood turned to ice. "Tomorrow? The hearing isn't for another week. She wants to meet the girls before the court date. And she's bringing her children, their cousins." She's trying to show them what their life could be like with her family. The rehook slammed into Richard with devastating clarity. Just when he'd begun to believe he might actually have a chance, just when the girls had started to trust him, Elena's sister was arriving to offer them something he couldn't. A complete family, a mother figure, siblings, a life that didn't require them to navigate the complicated emotions of bonding with a father who'd been absent for their entire existence. Rebecca wasn't just fighting for custody. She was fighting with weapons Richard couldn't match: stability, experience, and the promise that the girls wouldn't have to start over with someone they barely knew. As he drove home through the empty streets, Richard realized the real battle was just beginning. Everything he'd built with Sarah and Sophie over the past month was about to be tested against the vision of a life he couldn't provide. The question that haunted him wasn't whether he could win in court. It was whether he deserved to. Rebecca Morrison turned out to be everything Richard had feared she would be. She arrived at Mrs. Patterson's house on Thursday afternoon like a force of nature, warm, confident, and completely prepared. She brought her 2 children, Emma, age 8, and Lucas, age 6, who immediately began playing with Sarah and Sophie as if they'd known each other their entire lives. Richard watched from the porch as his daughters laughed for the first time in weeks. Really laughed, the kind of carefree sound that only came when children felt completely safe and understood. Emma had brought a collection of friendship bracelets to share. Lucas taught them a card game their mother had apparently loved as a child. Within an hour, the 4 children were inseparable. "They need this," Rebecca said, settling beside Richard on the porch steps. "They need family who knows where they come from." She wasn't cruel about it. If anything, she was kind, speaking with the gentle authority of someone who'd raised children through difficult transitions before. She told him stories about Elena that he'd never heard. How Elena had called her every week during her pregnancy, terrified but excited. How she'd sent photos and videos constantly during the girls' first years. How she'd made Rebecca promise to love Sarah and Sophie as her own if anything ever happened. "She never mentioned you," Rebecca said, and the words cut deep. "Not once in all those conversations. I didn't even know you existed until the lawyer contacted me about the custody case." Richard felt the foundation he'd been building crack beneath his feet. "She kept us a secret from each other. Elena was protecting them, and maybe protecting you too. She knew how much your career meant to you. She didn't want to be the obligation that held you back." The observation stung because it held more truth than Richard wanted to acknowledge. 5 years ago, he had been a different man, driven, ambitious, measuring success in stock options and market share. Would he have welcomed the news of twins? Would he have chosen fatherhood over the empire he was building? He wanted to believe he would have, but the uncertainty gnawed at him. That evening, Rebecca invited him to join them all for dinner at a local restaurant. It was meant as a gesture of goodwill, but it felt like a test Richard was destined to fail. Rebecca's children were polite, articulate, and clearly adored by their mother. They included Sarah and Sophie in their conversations naturally, as if the 4 of them had always been siblings. Rebecca herself was patient with every spilled drink and answered every question with the kind of practiced calm that came from years of experience. Richard, meanwhile, felt clumsy and out of place. When Sophie asked if she could have more ketchup, he signaled the waiter 3 times before getting his attention. When Sarah's shoelace came untied, he knelt to retie it and couldn't remember how to make a proper bow. These were basic parenting skills that Rebecca executed without thinking, while he fumbled through each interaction like he was learning a foreign language. The worst moment came when Emma asked Sarah and Sophie if they wanted to come live with them in Portland. "You could have your own room," she said excitedly. "And there's a really good school with a playground that has swings and monkey bars. And Mom said we could get a dog." Sarah looked across the table at Richard with an expression he couldn't quite read. Sophie clapped her hands together. "A dog, a golden retriever," Lucas added. "Mom already said yes." Richard felt the conversation slipping away from him. How could he compete with a dog? With cousins who already loved them? With a woman who had Elena's approval and years of preparation for this exact moment? But then Sophie surprised him. She looked at Rebecca and said, "What about Daddy?" Rebecca's smile faltered for just a moment. "Well, sweetie, you could still visit him. Or he could visit you." It wouldn't mean you'd never see him again. But he just found us, Sarah said quietly. We just found each other. The silence that followed was deafening. Rebecca looked genuinely pained, as if she was realizing for the first time that there were no clean solutions to this situation. Every choice meant someone would lose something precious. Richard excused himself to the restroom, where he stared at his reflection in the fluorescent lighting and tried to figure out how to fight for something when he wasn't even sure what winning looked like anymore. These children deserved stability, love, and a future that didn't require them to choose between the adults who cared about them. When he returned to the table, Rebecca was helping Sophie wipe chocolate sauce off her chin, and Sarah was showing Lucas a drawing she'd made of a house with 3 stick figures standing in front of it. Richard recognized himself in one of those figures, tall, wearing what looked like a tie, with a smile drawn in permanent black marker. The rehook crystallized in that moment. This wasn't just about him fighting for custody anymore. This was about what was truly best for Sarah and Sophie, even if that meant stepping aside for someone who could offer them everything he couldn't. The question was whether he was brave enough to put their needs before his own desperate desire to be their father. The breakthrough came from a most unexpected source, Sarah's nightmare. It happened on the last Saturday before the custody hearing. Richard had been granted a full-day visit, and he'd planned something special, a trip to the Children's Museum followed by dinner at their favorite pizza place. It was meant to be perfect, a golden memory they could carry with them regardless of what the court decided. But 20 minutes into the museum visit, Sarah collapsed. Not physically. She simply stopped moving, stopped responding, stood frozen in the middle of the dinosaur exhibit while families flowed around her like water around a stone. Her eyes were open but distant, and when Richard knelt beside her and spoke her name, she didn't seem to hear him. Sophie noticed immediately. She does this sometimes, she said matter-of-factly, when she gets scared about forgetting Mama. Richard felt panic rise in his throat. What do I do? You have to wait, Sophie said with the gravity of someone far older than 6. And then you have to remind her that Mama loved her. So Richard waited. He sat on the museum floor beside his daughter while curious strangers stepped around them, and he waited for her to come back to him. It took 15 minutes. When Sarah's eyes finally focused again, she looked at him with such raw vulnerability that he nearly broke down right there among the plastic T-Rex displays. I'm forgetting her voice, she whispered. I can see her face in the pictures, but I can't remember what she sounded like. Richard didn't have an answer for that, but he had an idea. That evening, instead of going to the pizza place, he drove the girls back to Elena's house. Now empty, waiting to be sold, but still holding 5 years of memories in its walls. Mrs. Patterson had given him the key, thinking he might want to collect some of Elena's belongings for the girls. But Richard had a different plan. He led Sarah and Sophie to Elena's bedroom, where her old laptop still sat on the dresser. With trembling hands, he opened it and found what he was looking for, videos. Dozens of them. Elena had documented everything. First steps, first words, birthday parties, bedtime stories, random Tuesday afternoons where nothing special happened except that she wanted to remember the sound of her daughters laughing. They spent 3 hours on that bed, the 3 of them huddled together, watching Elena's life unfold on a 13-inch screen. Richard saw his ex-wife become a mother, watched her grow into the role with a grace he'd never witnessed during their marriage. He heard her voice again, still the same laugh, still the same way of saying, "Sweetie," when she was being particularly tender. And he saw something else. In the background of nearly every video, evidence of financial struggle. The same clothes worn over and over. Birthday parties in the backyard instead of rented venues. Christmas mornings with carefully wrapped gifts from discount stores. Elena had been proud. She'd never asked him for help, never let on that she was struggling to raise their children alone. She'd chosen dignity over support, independence over the complications that would have come with involving him in their lives. Mama said you were busy with important work, Sophie said during one video where Elena explained why Daddy couldn't come to her school play. She said you built buildings and helped people with their money, Sarah added. She said that was important too. Richard closed the laptop gently. The weight of understanding settled over him like a heavy blanket. Elena hadn't kept the girls from him out of spite or revenge. She'd done it because she believed, wrongly but genuinely, that his life was more important than theirs, that his dreams mattered more than daily feedings and scraped knees and parent-teacher conferences. She'd been protecting him from a responsibility she thought he didn't want. And in doing so, she'd robbed all three of them of 5 irreplaceable years. But here was the rehook that changed everything. Sarah looked at him as he processed this revelation and said, "Aunt Rebecca seems nice, but she doesn't know about Mama's videos." "What do you mean?" "She wants us to start over. New house, new family, new everything. But we don't want to forget. We want to remember." Sophie nodded vigorously. "We want to keep Mama's things and her voice and her stories. Aunt Rebecca says those things will make us sad." Richard understood then that this custody battle wasn't just about who could provide the best life for Sarah and Sophie. It was about who would honor Elena's memory, who would let these children grieve and heal at their own pace, who would understand that moving forward didn't require leaving the past behind. Rebecca meant well. She could offer the girls stability, siblings, a complete family structure. But she wanted to heal them by helping them forget. Richard wanted to heal them by helping them remember. The question was which approach the court would consider more loving. The custody hearing began on a Monday morning under gray skies that threatened rain. Richard had barely slept the night before, his mind cycling through every possible scenario, every argument Rebecca's lawyer might make, every way this could go wrong. He'd spent 2 weeks preparing, not just legally, but emotionally. He'd had the house renovated to accommodate 2 children, complete with bedrooms decorated in colors the girls had chosen themselves. He'd enrolled in a parenting class and lined up a therapist who specialized in helping children process grief. He'd even learned how to braid hair, though his attempts still looked like abstract art compared to Elena's perfect plaits in the videos. Most importantly, he'd spent time simply being present. Not trying to win their affection or prove his worth, but sitting with them through the hard moments when grief hit unexpected, reading the same stories over and over until they felt like old friends, and learning that love wasn't something you achieved. It was something you practiced daily, imperfectly, with patience and hope. The courtroom was fuller than he'd expected. Rebecca sat with her lawyer and her husband, projecting the quiet confidence of someone who'd never doubted the righteousness of their cause. Behind them sat Mrs. Patterson, whose testimony would be crucial. She was the only neutral party who'd observed both Richard's relationship with the girls and Rebecca's visit. Judge Martinez called the proceedings to order with the weary efficiency of someone who'd presided over too many broken families. Rebecca's lawyer spoke first, painting a picture of stability and continuity. Rebecca had been present during Elena's illness. She had an established home, experience with children, and the immediate ability to provide the girls with siblings and a mother figure. "My client isn't trying to erase these children's father," the lawyer said, "but she can offer them something he cannot, a family that's already whole." When it was Patricia's turn to speak, she didn't try to minimize Rebecca's strengths. Instead, she focused on something deeper: the girls' own wishes and their need to process their grief in an environment that honored their mother's memory. "Mr. Chun isn't asking this court to ignore his past absence," Patricia said. "He's asking for the chance to build a future. And most importantly, he's asking for the chance to help his daughters heal in a way that preserves their connection to the mother they lost." The judge listened impassively as both sides presented their evidence. Then came the testimonies that would decide everything. Mrs. Patterson spoke first, describing the past month with painful honesty. She talked about Richard's daily visits, his patience with the girls' emotional ups and downs, and the gradual transformation she'd witnessed in all 3 of them. But she also acknowledged Rebecca's love for the girls and her genuine desire to provide them with a stable home. Both parties love these children, she concluded. The question is which environment will help them flourish. Then Rebecca took the stand. She spoke eloquently about her plans for the girls' future, the schools they would attend, the activities they could participate in, the support system her extended family could provide. She painted a picture of Sunday dinners and family vacations and holiday traditions that could help Sarah and Sophie feel like they belonged to something larger than their grief. I can give him the child that Elena would have wanted them to have, she said. A childhood free from the complications of the past. When Richard's turn came, he walked to the stand feeling like he was carrying the weight of every mistake he'd ever made. He spoke about discovering the girls at Elena's grave, about the moment he realized he'd lost 5 years he could never get back. He admitted his failures, his absence, his ignorance, his inability to be the husband Elena had needed him to be. But then he talked about the videos they'd watched together, about Sophie's nightmares and Sarah's careful questions, about the way they'd begun to trust him not because he was perfect, but because he'd shown up consistently, day after day, even when it was difficult. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him, "I can't give these girls back their mother. I can't undo the years I missed. But I can promise them that they will never have to wonder if they're loved, never have to doubt that someone will fight for them, and never have to choose between remembering their mother and building a future." The judge recessed for 2 hours to deliberate. Richard, Rebecca, and the girls waited in separate rooms, the tension so thick it was hard to breathe. When they reconvened, Judge Martinez looked directly at Sarah and Sophie, who sat in the front row between Mrs. Patterson and a court advocate. "This is an unusual case," she began. "Both parties can provide loving homes. Both have compelling arguments. But family court isn't just about what adults think is best. It's about what serves the children's highest interests." Richard's heart hammered against his ribs. After reviewing all the evidence and testimonies, this court awards primary custody to Richard Chun, with visitation rights for Rebecca Morrison to ensure the girls maintain their relationship with their extended family. The courtroom erupted in quiet chaos. Rebecca's husband put his arm around her as tears began to fall. Patricia gripped Richard's shoulder. Mrs. Patterson smiled through her own tears. But Richard barely heard any of it, because Sarah and Sophie had turned toward him with expressions of relief so profound that he finally understood what Elena's letter had really meant when she'd asked him to love them. It wasn't a request. It was a recognition of something that had already been true from the moment he'd first seen their faces. They were his. They had always been his. And now, finally, legally and forever, he was theirs. 1 year later, Richard stood in the kitchen of their home. Really their home now, not just a house where they happened to live, making pancakes on a Sunday morning while Sarah helped measure ingredients and Sophie fed scraps to their golden retriever puppy, Einstein. The dog had been a compromise with Rebecca, who visited every other month and had gradually become not an adversary, but an ally in the complex work of raising 2 children who carried their mother's spirit in different ways. Emma and Lucas came for summer visits, and the 4 cousins had developed the kind of fierce loyalty that only grew between children who'd weathered storms together. The house itself had evolved into something Richard never could have imagined during his bachelor years. Artwork covered the refrigerator. Toys migrated from room to room with mysterious consistency. The walls held photos from Elena's collection alongside new memories they were creating: school plays, birthday parties, quiet afternoons reading together on the couch that had replaced Richard's expensive and entirely impractical leather furniture. Most mornings began like this one: chaotic, imperfect, and filled with the particular joy that came from small people who felt safe enough to be completely themselves in their own home. "Daddy, Einstein ate my sock," Sophie announced from the floor where she was engaged in a losing battle to retrieve her yellow sock from the puppy's mouth. "Trade him," Sarah suggested without looking up from the measuring cup. "Give him one of your old socks." "That's not how it works," Sophie protested, but she was giggling. Richard flipped the pancakes and marveled, not for the first time, at how completely his life had reorganized itself around these moments. The business empire still existed. He'd restructured it to be manageable from anywhere, which meant he could attend school functions and emergency dentist visits and random Tuesday afternoons when one of the girls needed help with homework. Money mattered less now. Success had been redefined entirely. The pancakes were ready just as the timer on his phone reminded him about their weekly video call with Elena's parents, who lived across the country but had become unexpectedly important figures in all their lives. Sarah and Sophie ran to the computer, Einstein trailing behind them. and Richard followed, carrying plates and forks and the maple syrup Sophie preferred over everything else. Elena's mother, Carmen, appeared on screen with her usual warm smile. "They're my beautiful girls," she said, and Sarah and Sophie beamed back at her. They talked for 20 minutes about school and friends and whether Einstein was learning not to chew furniture. Carmen asked Richard about his work and thanked him, as she did every week, for sending regular photos and videos. The conversation was easy now, natural, the awkwardness of those first interactions replaced by genuine affection. Before they hung up, Carmen said something that stopped Richard cold. "Elena would be proud of all of you." After the call ended, the girls went outside to play in the backyard while Richard cleaned up the breakfast dishes. Through the window, he could see them teaching Einstein to fetch, their laughter carrying on the morning breeze. His phone buzzed with a text from Patricia. "Final adoption papers are ready for your signature." "Congratulations, Dad." Richard set the phone down and looked around the kitchen, really looked at it. Crayon marks on the cabinet doors that he'd stopped trying to clean off. A hand-drawn family portrait held to the refrigerator with butterfly magnets. Sophie's red sweater draped over a chair, the same sweater she'd been wearing the day he found them. The man who'd walked into that cemetery a year ago had been looking for closure, for a way to say goodbye to guilt that had been eating him alive. He'd found something infinitely more valuable, the chance to say hello to a life he'd never imagined but couldn't live without. The girls burst through the back door, Einstein bounding ahead of them, all of them covered in grass stains and grinning. "Daddy, can we make cookies after lunch?" Sophie asked, already knowing the answer. "Can we make the ones with chocolate chips?" Sarah added. "We can make whatever kind you want," Richard said, pulling them both into a hug that smelled like sunshine and puppy breath and the particular sweetness of children who knew they were unconditionally loved. As they spent the afternoon baking cookies that turned out lopsided and perfect, Richard thought about the letter Elena had left him. She'd asked him to love them, even if he couldn't forgive her. But there was nothing to forgive. Elena had made the best decisions she could with the information she had. She'd raised two extraordinary daughters who were kind, resilient, and capable of loving a father they'd only known through stories and hope. She'd given them the foundation they needed to trust again, to bond again, to build a family from the scattered pieces of loss and regret. The cookies came out of the oven golden brown and smelling like every childhood memory Richard had never had but was finally creating. Sarah and Sophie carefully arranged them on a plate, while Einstein waited patiently for the inevitable drop crumbs. "These are for Mama," Sophie announced, setting aside 3 perfectly round cookies. "For when we visit her next week." They had established a routine of monthly cemetery visits, bringing flowers or drawings or, apparently, homemade cookies. It wasn't sad anymore. It was simply part of how they honored the woman who'd brought them all together, even in her absence. That evening, after the girls were asleep and the house had settled into quiet, Richard sat in his study, writing in the journal he'd kept since that first night at Mrs. Patterson's house. He wrote about Sophie's gap-toothed grin when she'd successfully rolled her first chocolate chip cookie. He wrote about Sarah's growing confidence, the way she'd started volunteering answers in their nightly math practice instead of waiting to be asked. He wrote about the profound privilege of being trusted by children who had every reason to be cautious with their hearts. Most of all, he wrote about Elena, how he understood now that love wasn't just about being present. It was about making choices that honored the people you cared about, even when those choices cost you everything. Elena had loved him enough to let him go. She'd loved her daughters enough to raise them without burdening them with a father who might not have been ready to choose them over everything else. And somehow, in the end, that love had created the space for him to become the father he needed to be. The final entry that night was simple. "Today we made cookies." Tomorrow, Sophie has a dentist appointment, and Sarah wants to finish her book report. These are the most important things in my world. He closed the journal and walked upstairs to check on the girls one more time before bed. Sarah was sleeping with Elena's old teddy bear tucked under her arm. Sophie had kicked off her blankets and was sprawled across the bed like a starfish, completely at peace. Richard stood in their doorway for a long time, watching them breathe, marveling at the miracle of their existence and his presence in it. The man who'd built a fortune from nothing had learned that the most valuable things couldn't be earned or purchased or strategically acquired. They could only be received with gratitude and protected with fierce, daily commitment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, school projects and playground politics, and 1,000 tiny crises that made up the landscape of childhood. There would be moments when he felt inadequate, when he made mistakes, when the girls tested boundaries or grieved their mother or simply needed more than he knew how to give. But tonight, in this house filled with laughter echoes and cookie crumbs and the particular peace that came from keeping promises to the people who mattered most, Richard Chun had everything he'd ever really needed. He turned off the hallway light and headed to his own room, where Elena's letter sat framed on his nightstand, not as a reminder of guilt, but as a reminder of grace. She'd asked him to love their daughters if he found them. What she hadn't known was that in finding them, they would teach him what love actually meant. And that was the greatest gift any of them could have received. Not just a family reunited, but hearts finally opened wide enough to hold all the love they'd been meant to share from the very beginning. The cookies were still warm when he finally fell asleep, and his dreams were full of pancake mornings and braided hair and 2 little girls who called him daddy like they meant it. Outside, rain began to fall gently on the house where 3 people had learned to build something beautiful from the broken pieces of what had come before. Inside, Einstein curled up on his favorite blanket. The children slept soundly in beds that would be theirs forever, and a man who'd once measured success in profit margins now counted his wealth in goodnight kisses and the promise of tomorrow's breakfast. The ending wasn't dramatic. It was simply true. Love had found a way to bloom in soil that had seemed too damaged to grow anything at all. And that was the most miraculous thing of all. Thanks for watching. Let me know what you think in the comments section below. If you haven't already, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. We upload new emotional stories daily that speaks to the heart. Stick with us as we bring you more stories that remind you that compassion is real and love always finds a way. See you in the next video.